Jesus, 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 calling on Jesus.
Jesus, Jesus.
When we wake up, Jesus,
Jesus, Jesus.
when we talk, it's Jesus,
Jesus, Jesus.
all power in Jesus,
Jesus, Jesus.
come in, it's Jesus,
Jesus, Jesus.
and I pray it's Jesus,
Jesus, Jesus.
in my walk, it's
Jesus, Jesus.
when we stand up, it's Jesus, Jesus in this jam, Jesus, Billy Goodman,
Jesus.
up in heaven, it's Jesus,
Jesus.
on earth, it's Jesus,
Jesus, Jesus.
sing it loud, Jesus,
Jesus, Jesus.
He's our healer. We in prison singing Jesus,
Jesus, Jesus.
in the streets, it's Jesus,
Jesus, Jesus.
when we forgive,
Jesus,
need a friend,
Jesus.
for protection,
Jesus,
say it louder,
Jesus.
I love you all in the name of
Jesus.
the whole world is Jesus,
Jesus,
Jesus in the trenches, in the church, in the car,
Jesus, Jesus.
Jesus,
Jesus, Jesus.
in the trenches, in the church,
Jesus, Jesus.
in the car,
Jesus, Jesus.
at work,
Jesus, Jesus.
when you're alone,
Jesus, Jesus.
at home,
Jesus, Jesus.
all pivot,
Jesus, Jesus.
just need like Jesus,
Jesus,
simply Jesus,
Jesus.
love with Jesus,
Jesus,
sing it louder,
Jesus.
I love you all in the name of
Jesus, Jesus.
the whole world